Hi, I'm Sandeep and you're watching Indian Weekender. Today we have got a very distinguished guest here in our studio, which I'm sure the moment I will start telling you about him, you will be able to recognize him. He is a former international civil servant. He is an accomplished politician. He is a great orator. He's a best-selling author. And above all, I personally believe, riding on his intellectual process, he often seems to be a man on the mission. I think you would have guessed by now, we have got Dr Shashi Tharoor at our studio. Welcome to our studio, sir.
Good to be with you, Sandeep.
So, first of all, how has been Auckland weather so far treated you?
Well, I've not been here 24 hours yet, but in that time the weather must have changed about 17 times. So it certainly seems an extraordinarily variable climate.
Sure, it is. And this is something that we really enjoy over here. We learn to live with that.
If you don't like the weather, wait a minute. 10 minutes and with something else.
Better. Now, sir, before I start this interview, I would like to acknowledge the challenge of interviewing Shashi Tharoor. You definitely are an audience delight, I understand that, but you definitely poses significant challenges to interviewer. Just because you are so seamless and bountiful, it becomes difficult to have a meaningful conversation within a given period of time, but I will still make my humble effort. So, first of all, you are here to talk about your two books. Your first book is Why I'm a Hindu. So what this book is all about? Can you tell us more?
Well, Why I'm a Hindu is essentially an attempt to sort of define the Hindu religion for the very large silent majority of Hindus growing up in India, and indeed I would say in many parts of the world, who don't identify with the aggressive and rather narrow-minded Hindutva that has now become the dominant articulation of Hinduism in India today. I see Hindutva as a purely political ideology and Hinduism as a liberal, accepting and eclectic faith. So the first thing to do is to just describe the religion. As I grew up with it, as I read about it, the lessons of the great Mahatmas and preceptors of the faith, and the philosophies that have been encoded over a few thousand years in the Hindu canon. Having described the nature of the faith, I then go in and do discuss Hindutva and its beliefs, and finally in the last section I call it Taking Back Hinduism, which is a plea and an argument to recapture the spirit of the kind of Hinduism that most Hindus have grown up with. So that's broadly speaking the theme of the book Why I'm a Hindu.
Sure. So is it fair to say that you are on a mission to construct or reconstruct a new intellectual narrative for the Congress Party?
Well, I think that would be presumptuous of me to suggest. First of all, new is already a contentious word because many of these ideas have appeared in my earlier books. Those are familiar with my writings. The great Indian novel going back to 1989 has its obsession with dharma. In my novel Riot, which talks about the Ram Janmabhoomi agitation, I talk about the very key issues arising out of the Hindutva project. And in my book India from Midnight to the Millennium in 1997, 20 years ago, I actually explored my personal reactions as a Hindu Indian to the destruction of the Babri Masjid and so on 5 years later. So there's nothing in that sense that new in what I'm doing. Intellectual, I plead guilty. Narrative, to some degree, yes. But when you say for the Congress Party doesn't ask me to write my books. That's my own initiative. I speak for myself. If people in the Congress Party seek to identify with what I have to say, I'm delighted. I was very honored when one of the giants of our party, Dr Singh, joined me in the launching of this book in Delhi. He's an authority on Sanskrit and on the Hindu faith, and when he speaks, people listen on these subjects. So I'm very happy about that, but nor do I expect anyone to stand up and say that this is the Congress Party's view. No, this is Shashi Tharoor's view, and let's leave it there.
So when you say that reclaiming Hinduism, doesn't it imply that you're trying to reclaim it for the Congress, which is...
I'm reclaiming it for myself and for Hindus like myself. The Congress Party embraces a wide range of people of every conceivable faith. And I would say that we have Hindus as well as Muslims, Christians, Parsis, you name it. And Sikhs, of course. But having said that, we in the Congress Party I would believe have as political beliefs a set of ideas that are not dissimilar to what I've talked about. I'll give you one concrete example. When I talk about Hinduism, I anchor myself a lot on Swami Vivekananda, who actually did much of his preaching, in fact, almost all of it in English. So I can truly claim to have read everything he said in the original and not through translation. Whereas all the Sanskrit texts I have only read in various translations. I don't read or understand Sanskrit in that kind of fluency. But Swami Vivekananda, in his historic address to the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893, said something very profound. He said, "My religion has taught the world not just tolerance, but acceptance." Now, I read that as a teenager and it stayed with me ever since. And I've been thinking about it for a long time, because we all grow up being told that tolerance is a virtue. A tolerant king, a tolerant government, a tolerant system. And yeah, tolerance is a virtue, but it's a very patronizing virtue. Because the idea of tolerance says, I have the truth, you are in error, but I will magnanimously indulge you in your right to be wrong. Whereas what Swami Vivekananda says that Hinduism talks about is acceptance of difference. What does that mean? It means I say, I believe I have the truth, you believe you have the truth, I will respect your truth, please respect my truth. And that is a much better basis to get along with people of other faiths and other beliefs. That is the Hindu way. And by my definition, that's also the democratic way. That's how in a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilinguistic culture and civilization like that of India, we all get along. Because our democracy enables us to respect each other, even where there are fundamental differences between us.
Sure, it is. Now, if democracy is a parameter to judge the validity and strength of an argument, then probably the results that we are getting recently, say back in Karnataka or in Gujarat, it is probably not doing justice to the idea that you are trying to...
No, the Congress party got 2.5% more votes than the BJP did. So the public, the people of India are not at all disagreeing with this articulation. Of course, in our first past the post system, the way in which the votes fall will make a difference. And so clearly the BJP's votes, though fewer than the Congress's in percentage, were better concentrated in certain seats, and so they won more seats. And they won 104 seats and the Congress won only 78. But the fact is that the percentage of votes garnered by each party gives the Congress a very clear edge.
Well, don't you think like it is kind of trying to find a solace, because the system is there anyways, and we all will have to abide by the system, and if Congress needs to come back to power, they will have to go through that system itself. So don't you think it's kind of finding a solace?
Sure, but why wouldn't you want to find solace? That way, you know, when the Congress offers a coalition arrangement to the JDS, that's not solace. That's unfortunately very, very clear-cut politics. And now the Congress and the JDS together go to government and say we've got 78 plus 37, which is 115 against the BJP's 104. We should be forming the government. Now that's the kind of thing that is realpolitik for you. I'm not just taking solace in the 2.5% votes more. I'm saying we have the numbers to form a credible government.
Okay. Now coming to the other idea that you are very passionate about is India's soft power. So what we want to know is that you are kind of a man on a mission, two different missions. One is, of course, reclaiming Hinduism for Congress, I believe, and second is projecting India's soft power. So which one of these two missions you adore most?
No, I mean, for me, obviously, I'm an Indian first, and everything else, including political affiliation, comes later. As an Indian, and I've lived abroad for a very long time, I think something like 34 of my 62 years have been spent outside India. So to this degree, I'm even more an NRI than I am a resident Indian,
sure.
Though the last 9 years are well on the way to redressing the balance.
Our viewers and readers over here identify more.
That's right. But I first started talking about soft power when I was living in New York in the beginning of the century. And Joe Nye, the man who came up with the concept for the first time, happened to be a friend of mine. I wrote to him, sending him some of my thoughts on applying the theory to India, and he applauded and encouraged me and liked what I had to say. And ever since, I not only articulated that in a series of speeches and articles, but then I brought the idea back to India and started pushing it very hard, to the point where even our own Prime Minister started using the word soft power in his speeches. But having said that, soft power is not something that a government can leverage. It's not PR or propaganda, because most people will see propaganda for what it is. Soft power has to do with the kind of images about your country that are evoked in the minds of foreigners, whether or not you're trying to sell it to them. Sure. It's not about good marketing, which is, I'm afraid, what our Prime Minister is better at. It's about what is India? How do people see India? And so it includes everything from the popularity of Bollywood movies to the success and proliferation of yoga, to Indian restaurants around the globe, to Indian wellness like Ayurveda and yoga, Indian spirituality, all of these things together, Indian fashion designers who now seem to be sweeping the Golden Globes and the Emmys and the Oscars even, all of these things together all contribute to an image of India as something. What is that something? It's got to be in a positive way. Now, unfortunately, in recent years, this kind of soft power of India has been undercut by alternative sets of headlines. Headlines about attacks on women, headlines about mob violence, cow vigilantism. All of this sort of stuff tends to dominate foreign perceptions. And that too undermines soft power colossally. I came across last year the horrifying story of an Indian PhD student who was turned down by a woman doctoral supervisor in Germany purely on the grounds that he came from a culture that couldn't respect women, so we can't use you in our system. And he had to explain, I'm sorry, our culture does represent women and respect women. This is an undermining of our culture. This is not who I am or what my culture is. But these perceptions have definitely undercut India's soft power.
Don't you think this is a part of the broader contest between the left and the right ideologies? Don't you think this is more an outcome of that?
Well, look, when it comes to how the New York Times or the New Zealand Herald or the Melbourne Age write about India, I don't see where India's left and right have anything to do with it. It's do we, in our own developments and occurrences in India, give foreign journalists and those who are writing about us for foreign audiences good stories to write or bad stories? It's what happens in our countries that matters.
That foreign journalists sometimes they try to find pleasure out of reporting everything bad about India.
No, you see, there's a general problem with the media, and I'm sorry you belong to it, Sandeep, because the media tends to say that, man bites dog is news, dog bites man is routine. So anything that's routine, they don't bother to pay any attention to. Whenever there is any particular controversy, then of course that's something which makes the headlines in media generally. I mean, so bad news is news, good news is no news. Okay. Now this kind of approach, sadly, is widespread across the media around the world. Sure. Now, in a country like India, very often what gets reported in the foreign media are the things that we are already talking about in India. And in some cases, you're right, it's what they want to talk about, whether we give it importance or not. Sure. But it's very difficult to deny that some of the bad news stories about India in recent years are not relevant, because these are stories that have dominated discourse in India too. Sure. And as a result, it's impossible to get away from. So it's better for a government of India that's keen on projecting India's soft power to curb such incidents at home and create an environment in which people say, God, this is a great country to be, rather than saying, don't visit, don't wear short skirts, don't go out after dark, and so on. Because if that's what people are being told, that's inevitably what will be reflected in the coverage.
Sure, I agree with that part. Now, despite your argument, which is very persuasive, it seems to be a very persuasive argument, but the fact of the matter is that the projections articulated by your opponents, or say Prime Minister Modi and his party, it is more sellable and gaining more traction outside India, even amongst Indian diaspora. So
good. Look, I want India to be well regarded. I've often said very openly and publicly, I'm an Indian first. If India succeeds under Mr. Modi, if our economy grows, if people prosper, I'll be happy. If, as a result of Mr. Modi's policies, the economy doesn't grow and people aren't finding the achhe din they were waiting for, then it's my duty as an opposition MP to point it out. The fact is that we in the opposition are also part of the national narrative. Sure. We want India to succeed. We may disagree about whether India is succeeding and how it should be helped to succeed. That's part of democracy. You have that in New Zealand, we have it in India. Sure. What I don't like and resent is having the legitimacy of our criticisms being challenged, as if to say anything against Mr. Modi or the government is somehow anti-national. That is not what democracy is all about. In fact, it is a very nationalist thing to want the country to be better than it is today.
Sure, certainly it is. Now, I know that you're very passionate about that. Now, moving to something which is more relevant here to our Indian community in New Zealand. Recently, on May 14th, we celebrated Fiji Girmit Day.
Yes.
So, Girmit is something I'm sure you
I know it well. I know it well.
You have written well. So we want to know more about your opinion about this forced immigration or migration.
Yeah, I mean, indentured labor was a horrible development, which really, when the British were forced under international moral pressure, including from their own churches and so on, to abolish slavery, they came up with this very clever scheme. They would take poor people, often people indebted and otherwise in need of money, get them to sign these onerous contracts that essentially bonded them as labor for several years. But the fact is that once that contract was over, the people were in no position to go back because the fine print of various conditions that were implied, that were levied on their ability to go back, meant that in practice practically no one went back. I've given the exact figures in my book, Inglorious Empire. This was actually in many ways worse than slavery. I've looked at the numbers, for example, of people transported on ships, and not just to Fiji, but also in the other direction, to Mauritius, to South Africa, to the Caribbean countries. And let me tell you that in many cases, the deaths on those ships just to reach their destination were greater than those of the shackled slaves from West Africa who were transported as forced slaves into the same destinations. So the indentured labor were really in some ways a form of slavery and no better off, in some ways worse off in terms of the conditions. They were grossly badly treated, horrendously underpaid and exploited, given very few rights. And I think it's to the credit of the people of Indian origin in all these countries, in Mauritius, in Fiji, in South Africa, in the Caribbean islands, that they were able to make decent lives for themselves and become productive, efficient, prominent members of their new societies. I really admire them a great deal, and I think these Girmitia stories need to be told, revived, and I'm very pleased to see from your own last weekend's issue the stories of Indians, people of Indian origin of today's generation, going back and recounting the tales of their ancestors who were brought out through indentured labor, through either by hook or by crook. Sometimes people were cheated, sometimes people were basically kidnapped. All of these things happened, and it's incredibly important to remember these stories. As I said in the context of that book about our history generally, I fully understand the logic for the statement forgive and forget. And I'm all for forgiving because I believe that nurturing hatred is a negative emotion for individuals as well as for societies. But why forget? Remember, not forgive and forget. Forgive but remember.
Yeah, sure. I understand that is your underlying theme. That's why probably you are writing about Inglorious Empire, and you're telling our current generations about the evils and atrocities of the whole British colonial empire. Now the challenge is, like, if you evoke that emotion and you make them aware of their past, now the challenge is how do you think they should react for the future? Like when we're talking about, say, in terms of Fiji Girmitias, who have been born and brought up in an environment that was without any culture, a sense of understanding of culture or heritage. They are struggling to see how to relate to the future. And same with your call about talking about the evils of British colonial empire back in India as well. So how do you see that? How do you see that the current generation or the coming generation should be inspired by this?
Well, it should look to the future because, you know, what happened to their ancestors was like a British fist being punched into the heart of a beating civilization, ripping these people out, taking them away from their cultural context and moorings and dumping them somewhere else. They were wrenched from their past. It becomes very difficult now to go back and recapture that past. And frankly, now 140, 150 years have passed in many of these cases. How do you ever reconnect with that kind of past? So the logical answer would be to say, no, the past is the past. Let's focus on the future. If today you're a Fijian or an Australian or a New Zealand citizen, make your future there. Just remember where you came from. Don't ever forget the sacrifices encoded in your DNA through your ancestors. But now work for the future, and I wish you all success.
Sure, certainly. But that was in the context of Fiji Girmitias. Coming back to your book, when you were talking about the evils of colonial empire and kind of seeking reparation as well for India, what I want to understand is that when you are creating that kind of awareness among the people that most of the problems that we are facing in our current setup, they are inherited by the British misrule. Don't you think you are creating a sense of complacency for our current generation of
No,
politicians?
absolutely not. In fact, I keep stressing throughout the book that this is not in any way to excuse any of our current failures or justify any of our lack of
Habits are easier to form, isn't it?
No, the fact is that the British did reduce what was once a flourishing, rich and prosperous civilization into what it became. You know, in 1700, India is the richest country in the world, 27% of global GDP. As late as 1800, it's second richest, 23%. By 1947, it's one of the poorest, with less than 3% of global GDP and 90% of the population living below the poverty line. That's after 200 years of British rule. So we have to ask ourselves, who explains this transformation? How is it that the British left us with a literacy rate below 17% and only 8.8% of women being able to read and write? How can we explain that the life expectancy when the British left was 26 years of age? Every Indian born in the last year of British rule could expect only to live to the age of 26. How do we explain that the growth rate of the Indian economy in the entire first half of the 20th century under British rule was 0.01%. You know, when you go through number after number, the indictment can only be a savage indictment of British misrule and exploitation. They rule for themselves. Now, we can say that that was tough and so on, but now, of course, for 70 years, we have been ruling ourselves. And we are accountable for our own successes and failures. I never take comfort in blaming the past. I feel urgent and vital concerns about our present and our future. And I'm prepared as an Indian of today to work for the present and the future. But I don't see why I should cease to be aware of the past.
Well, that's a very articulate explanation. I think that will be quite inspirational, especially to the politicians back in India, to pull up their socks. They need to do a lot. There is a lot on the table still to be done. And to our viewers and readers, I can understand that this is a very, very breathtaking experience to hear from the man himself. And I'm sure you would know there is a lot more to come for this weekend. If you haven't yet bought your ticket from the Writers Festival, where Dr. Shashi Tharoor will be talking about both his books, then please go to their website and do buy the books. And you can hear more from there. Probably you'll get a chance to say hello to him personally and a photo op option as well. So with those wishes, I would like to let you go. Is there any other message that you want to give to our readers?
No, just delighted to see such a thriving, prosperous, flourishing and engaged Indian community in New Zealand. Very pleased to meet the editor of India Weekender. I think that it's great that I've already come across so many Indians in my first 24 hours here. I hope many more of you will come and listen to me. I'm afraid the first two events already sold out, but the third one on Saturday at 2:30, which is entitled Inglorious Empire and is dialogue with the critic Michael Williams, is still open and available. It's in the big 2,000-seat theatre. So please come, there are seats.
Sure.
Look forward to seeing your viewers and you on Saturday at 2:30, the 19th.
We will be there.
Thank you very much. Thanks, sir.